On Christmas Eve, a husband left his wife on the road. Alone and cold, she thought all was lost, until a stranger stopped and, upon looking at her, recognized something that changed everything. Elaine sat in the passenger seat, hands clenched in her lap. Roberto's voice cut through the car's small space. He was yelling, his face twisted in anger. She tried to answer, her voice soft, almost pleading. "Roberto, I didn't mean—" "Enough, Elaine. Always the same excuses. I'm tired of this," he barked, knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The car swerved slightly as Roberto pulled over. Tires crunched against the gravel shoulder. He slammed the brakes, jerking them both forward. "Get out!" he said, his voice low but cold. Elaine blinked, stunned. "What? Roberto, please!" She hesitated for a second, too long. Roberto leaned over, pushing the door open from her side. The cold December wind rushed in. "Get out, Elaine! I'm done!" Elaine slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands trembling. She stepped out of the car, the door clicking shut behind her. Roberto didn't look back. He hit the gas, and the car sped away, the tail lights disappearing down the empty road. Elaine stood still for a moment, staring at the darkness. The roar of the engine faded, leaving only silence. She wrapped her thin coat tighter around her body. It didn't do much to block the biting wind. Her legs felt weak, her heart pounding hard in her chest. She turned her head, looking up and down the road. There was nothing, just the long, empty stretch of asphalt disappearing into the night. Not a single car. Not a sound besides the wind rustling the dried grass. It felt like she was the only person left in the world. Elaine shivered, her teeth chattering. She started walking. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay there. Each step crunched on the gravel, echoing in the silence. Her thin shoes did little to keep her feet warm, and she could feel her toes growing numb. She thought of Roberto, his angry face, his harsh words. He had always been like this, controlling, cruel. Elaine remembered the first time he had yelled at her, how she'd thought it was just a bad day. But it never got better. It only got worse. And now, he'd left her here, on a deserted road, in the cold. A car sped past in the distance, its headlights bright against the dark. Elaine raised her hand, waving frantically. "Please, please stop," she called out. But the car didn't slow. It roared past her, the wind from it whipping her hair across her face. She lowered her hand, tears stinging her eyes. No one was coming to help. The sun had dipped below the horizon a while ago, and the cold was growing stronger. Elaine pulled her coat tighter, but it barely helped. She kept walking, her breath fogging up in the cold air. Her legs ached, her feet sore from the rough ground. She wanted to sit down, to rest, but she knew she couldn't. If she stopped, the cold would take over. She thought of her mother, how her mom had been everything to her, her only source of love and comfort. Losing her had been like losing a part of herself. It had left her alone, vulnerable. She had never fully recovered, and meeting Roberto had seemed like a chance for stability. But it wasn't. It had turned into something worse. The road stretched on, seemingly endless. The sky above was clear, stars twinkling in the deep black. Elaine kept walking, the chill seeping into her bones. She thought of her daughter, her sweet little girl, back home. She needed to get back to her. She couldn't just stay here and give up. The night was quiet, with only the wind and her own footsteps for company. The cold grew unbearable. Elaine's fingers were numb, Her face stung with the wind. She stopped for a moment, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to keep some warmth in. Her legs felt like they might give out. She heard a sound, distant but unmistakable. The low hum of a car engine. Her heart jumped. She turned, squinting down the dark road. Headlights were approaching, growing brighter as they neared. Elaine stepped closer to the road, raising her arm, waving again. Her voice cracked as she called out, "Please, help!" The car didn't slow. It sped past her, its red taillights quickly fading into the distance. Elaine's shoulders slumped, her hope draining. Tears spilled over her cheeks, freezing almost instantly in the cold. She stood there, feeling utterly alone. No one was coming. She wiped her eyes, sniffing, and started walking again. Each step was harder now. Her body ached, and she was so tired. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going. The wind whipped across the empty road, and she felt it down to her bones. It felt like hours had passed, but she knew it couldn't have been that long. She heard it again. Another engine. This one sounded deeper, louder. Elaine turned, her heart pounding. A truck was coming, its headlights bright. It slowed as it approached her, the tires crunching on the gravel. The truck pulled over, stopping just a few feet away. Elaine's heart raced, but she stayed where she was, unsure. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a thick coat, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He looked at her for a moment, then spoke. "Hey, you okay?" His voice was calm, but Elaine stepped back, her body tense. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I..." The man raised his hands, palms out. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. It's cold out here. You need a ride." Elaine didn't move. She wanted to say yes, but fear gripped her. What if he was dangerous? What if this was another trap? The man sighed, stepping closer but keeping his distance. "Look, I know you don't trust me. I get it. But you're gonna freeze out here." He reached into the truck, pulling out a blanket. He held it out to her. "Here, at least take this." Elaine looked at the blanket, then at the man. Her teeth were chattering, her body shaking from the cold. She hesitated, then took a step forward, her fingers brushing the fabric. It was warm. She took it, her eyes filling with tears again. "Thank you," she whispered, wrapping it around her shoulders. The man nodded. "Come on. I can take you somewhere safe. You don't have to be out here alone." Elaine looked at the truck, then back at the road. She knew she couldn't keep walking. She was too tired, too cold. She took a deep breath, then nodded. The man opened the passenger door, and she climbed in, her body still tense. He got back in, shutting the door. The truck was warm, the heat blasting through the vents. Elaine pulled the blanket tighter, her eyes closing for a moment. She still didn't know if she could trust him, but she had no choice. She needed to get off that road. She needed to survive. The truck started moving, the road stretching out ahead of them. Elaine kept her eyes on the darkness outside, her heart still pounding, but a small spark of hope flickering inside her. Maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. The night had fully descended. Elaine could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The darkness swallowed everything. She walked slowly, feeling her way along the gravel at the side of the road. Fear sat heavy in her chest. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and each step grew more painful. The temperature dropped, and the cold wind cut through her thin coat. Elaine hugged herself tighter. her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Her feet were like blocks of ice, and each movement felt like a struggle. She stumbled once, almost falling, but caught herself just in time. The pain in her legs was sharp, and her body felt like it was giving up. Elaine's mind wandered to her past, to her mother. She remembered that cold hospital room, the beeping machines. Her mother had held her hand until the very end. And then she was gone. Elaine had been left alone. She had been just a teenager, with no one to guide her. That loss had shaped her. It was a wound that never healed, a reminder that she was always alone. Now, out here, the loneliness felt even worse. She had no idea how long she could keep walking. The cold hand, waving, her voice cracking as she tried to call out, "Please, stop! Please!" The car sped closer, but it didn't slow. The headlights blinded her for a second. Then it was gone, the taillights disappearing into the dark. Elaine let her hand fall, her shoulders slumping. Her heart sank, and she felt the tears fall freely. No one was going to stop. No one was coming to help. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her body trembling from the cold. She had to keep going, even though every muscle in her body screamed at her to stop. She took a deep breath and forced herself to take another step. And another. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay there. The road seemed endless. Elaine stumbled again, her foot catching on a loose stone. She fell to her knees, her hands scraping against the rough ground. Pain shot up her arms, but she didn't have the energy to cry out. She stayed there for a moment, the gravel digging into her skin, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't do this. She didn't have anything left. Then she heard it again. An engine. This one sounded different, louder, heavier. Elaine lifted her head, squinting into the darkness. There was a truck coming, its headlights bright against the black sky. It slowed down as it neared her, and Elaine's heart pounded. She forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling, and stepped closer to the road. The truck pulled over, stopping a few feet away. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He looked at her for a long moment, then spoke. "You okay?" he asked, his voice carrying over the wind. Elaine stepped back, her body tense. She didn't answer. She didn't know if she could trust him. The man raised his hands. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise. You look like you need help." Elaine's throat was dry. She wanted to say something, but no words came. The man took a step closer, then stopped, sensing her hesitation. He sighed, then turned and walked back to the truck. Elaine watched as he reached inside and pulled out a thick blanket. "Phew, here," he said, holding it out to her. "It's too cold out here. Take this." Elaine stared at the blanket, then at the man. She wanted to take it, but fear held her back. She had trusted people before, and it had always ended badly. She shook her head, stepping back again. The man didn't move. He kept the blanket held out, his expression calm. "I'm not asking for anything. You don't have to say anything. Just take it." "You're gonna freeze out here." Elaine felt her eyes fill with tears again. Her hands shook as she reached out, taking the blanket from him. It was heavy, warm, and she wrapped it around herself, feeling a small bit of relief as the warmth seeped into her frozen skin. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man nodded. "You're welcome." He paused, then looked at her, concern in his eyes. "Listen, I can take you somewhere safe. You don't need to stay out here. I know you don't trust me, and I get that, but it's too cold to be out here alone." Elaine looked down the road, the darkness stretching endlessly in both directions. She knew he was right. She couldn't keep walking. She was too tired, too cold. She looked back at him, her body still trembling. "Okay," she said finally, her voice shaky. "Okay." The man nodded again, then walked to the passenger side of the truck and opened the door for her. Elaine took a deep breath, then stepped forward, climbing into the seat. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, her body tense. The man got in on the driver's side, shutting the door behind him. He started the truck, the engine rumbling to life, and they began to move. Elaine kept her eyes on the road, the darkness still pressing in around them, but for the first time that night, she felt a small flicker of hope. Elaine heard it again, a low, rumbling engine. It sounded closer this time. She turned, squinting down the road, her heart pounding in her chest. Headlights appeared, cutting through the darkness. It was a truck. The engine noise grew louder as it approached, the lights blinding her for a second. Elaine stepped to the edge of the road, waving her arm cautiously. The truck began to slow. Elaine's breath caught in her throat as it pulled to a stop just a few feet away. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a thick coat and a hat. His face was hard to see in the dim light. He walked toward her, hands visible, not making any sudden moves. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm, trying not to scare her. Elaine didn't answer. She took a step back, her heart racing, her body tense. She wasn't sure what to think, or if she could trust him. Fear clouded her mind. She had heard too many stories about what could happen to women alone on the road. The man stopped. He could see the fear in her eyes. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently. "You look like you need help, though." Elaine stood there, not moving. She wanted to trust him, but she couldn't. She couldn't take the risk. Her whole body shook, partly from the cold, partly from fear. The man sighed and took a step back. "Okay, I get it," he said. He turned and walked to the truck, opening the door. For a moment, Elaine thought he was going to leave. Her heart sank, but instead, he reached inside and pulled out a thick blanket. He turned back to her, holding it out. "Here, you look freezing. Take this, no strings attached." Elaine hesitated, her eyes moving from the blanket to the man. Her body screamed for warmth, and her hands shook. She stepped forward, slowly, her eyes locked on his. When she was close enough, she took the blanket from him, wrapping it around her shoulders. It was heavy, warm. She felt her muscles relax, even if just a little. "Thank you," she said softly. The man nodded. He stepped back, giving her space. "Listen, I can take you somewhere safe. I promise I'm not here to hurt you. I just don't want to leave you out here alone." Elaine didn't answer right away. She looked down the road, the darkness stretching on forever. She knew she couldn't stay there. She was too cold, too tired. Her legs felt like they could give out at any moment. She turned back to the man, her voice shaking. "Okay," she said, barely above a whisper. The man nodded again. He walked around to the passenger side of the truck, opening the door for her. Elaine hesitated, her heart pounding, her eyes darting around, but there was no one else, no other options. She took a deep breath, then stepped forward, climbing into the truck. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, her body tense as she sat down. The man climbed into the driver's seat, closing the door. The engine rumbled, the warmth from the vents filling the cabin. Elaine kept her eyes down, staring at her hands. She was still afraid, but she didn't have a choice. She needed to get away from that road. The truck began to move, the headlights cutting through the dark. The man kept quiet, glancing at her occasionally but not saying anything. Elaine was grateful for the silence. She wasn't ready to talk. She didn't know if she would ever be. They drove for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. The road was empty, dark, the only sound the hum of the engine and the soft rustling of the blanket as Elaine adjusted it around her shoulders. She could feel the warmth slowly returning to her fingers, her toes. The man cleared his throat, his voice quiet. "My name's Tom, by the way," he said. "What's your name?" Elaine looked at him, her eyes meeting his for just a second before she looked away. "Elaine?" she said, her voice barely audible. "Nice to meet you, Elaine," Tom said. He didn't push for more. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. Elaine watched the landscape outside the window change. The road grew narrower, the fields stretching out in the darkness, the moonlight barely illuminating the world around them. She saw lights in the distance. A farm, maybe. Her heart pounded as they got closer. "That's my place," Tom said, nodding toward the lights. "You can stay the night there. It's not much, but it's warm and safe." Elaine looked at him, her face a mix of fear and exhaustion. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she also knew she couldn't keep going like this. She nodded, her voice shaky. "Okay." The truck turned onto a dirt road, the tires crunching over the gravel. The lights grew closer, and Elaine could make out a small house, a barn behind it. It was simple, but it looked inviting. Tom pulled the truck to a stop in front of the house and turned off the engine. "Here we are," he said, his voice gentle. He looked at her. "You don't have to get out if you're not ready, but it's warm inside." Elaine took a deep breath, her fingers clutching the blanket. She looked at the house, the light in the window, then back at Tom. His face was calm, his eyes steady, no hint of threat. She nodded slowly, then opened the door. The cold hit her again as she stepped out, but it didn't feel as harsh now that she had the blanket around her. Tom walked ahead, opening the door to the house. He stepped aside, waiting for her. Elaine hesitated at the threshold, her body tense, her heart pounding. Then she stepped inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her immediately, the smell of something cooking in the air. It wasn't a big place, but it was cozy. Elaine looked around, her eyes taking in the simple furniture, the small fireplace, the worn rug on the floor. It was safe, at least for now. Tom closed the door behind her, moving to the kitchen. "I've got some soup on the stove," he said. "You're welcome to have some if you're hungry." Elaine nodded, her voice too shaky to answer. She felt a tear roll down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. Tom didn't look at her, giving her space. He moved around the kitchen, getting a bowl. "You can sit if you want," he said, his voice gentle. Elaine moved to the table, sitting down slowly. Her body felt heavy, exhausted. Tom placed a bowl of soup in front of her, steam rising from it. "Here," he said. "Eat up. You need it." Elaine picked up the spoon, her hands still trembling slightly. She took a small bite, the warmth spreading through her. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment. She took another bite, then another, her eyes closing as she tried to hold back more tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom nodded, sitting down across from her. He didn't say anything, just let her eat. Elaine kept her eyes on the bowl, her body slowly relaxing, the fear ebbing away just a little. She was still scared. She didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time that night, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. Elaine sat silently, the truck's cabin filled with warmth and the gentle hum of the engine. Tom kept his eyes on the road, glancing at her every now and then but not saying anything. Elaine pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes looking out at the dark landscape. Tom cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "It's a quiet drive, isn't it?" he said softly, trying to ease the tension. Elaine only nodded, her thoughts elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about how she ended up here, about Roberto and his anger. She wondered what would happen next. Would he come looking for her? Would he even care? The thought of him made her stomach churn, and she tried to push it out of her mind. Tom noticed her unease and decided to keep quiet. He drove steadily, the truck's tires rumbling softly over the road. After a while, he pointed ahead, towards a distant light on the horizon. "That's where we're headed," he said. "My place. You can rest there. It's safe." Elaine looked up, squinting at the faint light in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was something. She nodded again, not trusting her voice. She was too tired, too cold. She just needed somewhere to rest. As they got closer, Elaine could make out the outline of a small farmhouse and a barn behind it. It looked simple, but welcoming. Tom pulled up in front of the house, stopping the truck and turning off the engine. He looked at her, giving her a gentle smile. "We're here. You can come inside whenever you're ready." Elaine hesitated. She could feel her body wanting to stay in the warmth of the truck, but she also knew she needed to get out, to move. She took a deep breath, then nodded and opened the door. The cold hit her immediately, but she wrapped the blanket tighter around her and stepped out. Tom led the way to the front door, opening it and stepping aside for her to enter. Elaine paused at the threshold, her body still tense. She looked at Tom, then back at the warm light inside. She took another breath and stepped inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around her, and she felt her muscles relax slightly. Tom closed the door behind them, locking out the cold. He walked ahead into the kitchen, motioning for her to follow. "Make yourself comfortable. I've got some soup left on the stove." Elaine stood in the small living room, looking around. The house was simple: worn furniture, a small fireplace, some old pictures on the walls. It was nothing like the chaos of her apartment with Roberto. It felt safe. Tom moved around the kitchen, filling a bowl with soup and placing it on the table. "Here," he said, pulling out a chair for her. "You should eat. It'll help." Elaine hesitated, but moved forward, sitting down. She picked up the spoon, her hands still trembling slightly. She took a small sip, the warmth of the soup spreading through her. easing the cold that still lingered in her bones. She didn't realize how hungry she was until she had the first few bites. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful. Tom sat across from her, keeping his distance, not saying much. Elaine appreciated that. She didn't feel ready to talk. She just wanted to feel warm, to feel safe. Tom watched her, his face calm, his eyes filled with understanding. He knew better than to push. Once she finished the soup, Elaine put the spoon down, her hands resting on the table. She looked at Tom, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." Tom nodded. "You're welcome. You need anything else?" Elaine shook her head, her eyes dropping to her hands. She felt the tears building up again, but she quickly blinked them away. She didn't want to cry anymore. She was tired of feeling weak. Tom stood up, moving to a closet near the kitchen. He pulled out a pillow and a blanket, then looked back at her. "You can take the couch," he said, pointing to the small, worn sofa in the living room. "It's not much, but it's comfortable." Elaine nodded, standing slowly. She walked over to the couch, sitting down. Her body sank into the cushions, and she could feel the exhaustion taking over. Tom handed her the pillow and blanket, giving her a gentle smile. "Get some rest. You're safe here," he said. Elaine took the pillow, placing it at one end of the couch. She lay down, pulling the blanket over her, her eyes already closing. Tom turned off the lights, leaving only the soft glow of the fireplace. He moved quietly to the back of the house, leaving her alone. Elaine lay there, staring at the flickering flames. She could still feel the fear, the uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, she also felt a hint of something else. Safety. Maybe even hope. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew that for tonight, she was okay. She closed her eyes, her body relaxing, and let herself drift into sleep. Elaine woke up slowly, the first rays of morning sun seeping through a small window. She blinked, taking in her surroundings, the small room, the worn-out furniture, the faint sound of birds outside. It felt strange, safe, but strange. She hadn't woken up feeling like this in a long time. The blanket was still wrapped around her, and she pulled it closer, savoring the warmth. She could hear Tom moving in the kitchen. The scent of something brewing reached her, a mix of coffee and something else. She sat up, her body aching from the exhaustion of the previous night. It took a moment for everything to come back to her. Roberto, the road, the cold, the truck. Slowly, she stood, walking towards the kitchen. Tom was there, standing by the stove, stirring a pot. He looked up when she walked in, giving her a small smile. "Morning," he said, nodding toward the table. "There's coffee, if you want." Elaine nodded, moving slowly to the table. She sat down, her eyes glancing around the kitchen. It was simple: worn cabinets, mismatched chairs, an old table. It was clear this place had seen years of use, but it felt lived in, warm. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands still trembling slightly. Tom watched her, his movements calm and deliberate. He set a pot on the stove and turned back to her. "I've got some oatmeal here. It's not much, but it'll warm you up." Elaine looked at him, then at the coffee in front of her. She nodded, her voice soft. "That's fine. Thank you." Tom didn't push her for more. He just nodded and went back to the stove. Elaine sipped her coffee, letting the warmth spread through her. The silence was comfortable, and she found herself relaxing, even if just a little. After a few minutes, Tom brought a bowl of oatmeal to the table, setting it in front of her. He sat down across from her, his eyes gentle. "Eat up," he said. "You need it." Elaine picked up the spoon, taking a small bite. The oatmeal was hot, the warmth easing the cold that still lingered in her bones. She took another bite, then another. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment. Tom watched her, but he didn't say much. He seemed to understand that she wasn't ready to talk, and Elaine appreciated that. She needed time. She needed space. When she finished eating, Tom stood, taking the empty bowl from her. He put it in the sink and turned back to her. "I've got some work to do around the farm today," he said, his voice casual. "You're welcome to stay. I can show you around, if you want." Elaine hesitated. She wasn't sure if she wanted to stay. She wasn't sure if she could. But the thought of leaving, of going back out into the cold, empty road, it scared her. She looked at Tom, his face calm, his eyes steady. She nodded slowly. "Okay," Tom smiled. "Great. Come on, I'll show you the place." He led her outside, the morning sun warming the air slightly. The farm was small, just a house, a barn, a few pens for animals. Elaine could see chickens pecking at the ground, a couple of goats in a pen near the barn. Tom led her around, pointing out the different areas. "This here's the barn," he said, nodding toward the large, red building. "Got some tools in there, and a couple of animals. It's nothing fancy, but it does the job." Elaine followed him, her eyes scanning the area. It was quiet, peaceful. Nothing like the chaos of her life with Roberto. She could feel herself relaxing, her body loosening up. Tom led her to the goat pen, leaning on the fence. "You ever work with animals before?" he asked, looking at her. Elaine shook her head. "No, not really." Tom smiled. "It's easy enough. They just need food and a bit of attention. You can help, if you want." Elaine hesitated, then nodded. She didn't know what else to do. She needed something to focus on, something to keep her mind from wandering. Tom showed her how to feed the goats, how to check their water. He moved slowly, explaining everything, his voice calm and patient. Elaine listened, her hands moving carefully as she worked. She could feel a sense of purpose growing inside her, a feeling she hadn't had in a long time. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a start. When they finished with the goats, Tom led her to the chicken coop. He showed her how to gather the eggs, how to check for any problems. Elaine followed his instructions, her hands moving carefully. The chickens clucked around her, their feathers soft and warm. Tom watched her, his face gentle. "You're doing good," he said, his voice soft. Elaine looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks." Tom smiled back, then turned back to the chickens. They worked together for a while, the morning passing slowly. Elaine could feel her body relaxing, her mind calming down. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, but it wasn't as strong now. She was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, she could be okay. When they finished, Tom led her back to the house. He made them both a sandwich, setting it on the table in front of her. Elaine ate slowly, her body still exhausted. Tom sat across from her, his eyes calm. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said, his voice soft. "I'm not in any hurry to see you go." Elaine looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. She quickly blinked them away, nodding. "Thank you," she whispered. Tom nodded, not pushing her for more. He stood, moving to the sink to wash the dishes. Elaine watched him, her heart heavy. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that for now, she was safe. And that was enough. Elaine woke up early the next day. The sun was barely rising, casting a soft glow through the curtains. She lay there for a moment, wrapped in the blanket, listening to the quiet sounds of the farm. Birds chirped outside, and she could hear the faint bleating of the goats. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of calm. She got up, folding the blanket neatly and placing it on the couch. She walked to the kitchen, where she found Tom already awake, sipping a cup of coffee. He looked up as she entered, giving her a small smile. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's on the counter." Elaine nodded, pouring herself a cup. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her. Tom set his cup down, looking at her. "I've got some work to do today. You're welcome to help if you want. It's nothing fancy, just feeding the animals and cleaning up a bit." Elaine hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She needed something to do, something to keep her mind occupied. "Okay," she said softly. Tom smiled. "Great, let's get started, then." They walked outside together, the morning air cool and crisp. Tom led her to the goat pen, handing her a bucket of feed. Elaine took it, her hands still a bit shaky. She walked over to the fence, pouring the feed into the trough. The goats moved towards her, their noses nudging at the food. Elaine watched them, her hands resting on the edge of the fence. Tom stood next to her, his arms crossed. "You're getting the hang of it," he said, his voice encouraging. Elaine nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. She still felt the weight of everything that had happened, but out here, it seemed a little easier to bear. She watched the goats, the way they moved, their soft bleats filling the air. Tom led her to the barn next. He showed her how to clean the stalls, how to organize the tools. Elaine worked quietly, her hands moving slowly. But she was starting to feel a rhythm. It was simple work, but it was something, and that was enough for now. After a while, Tom paused, looking at her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Elaine looked up, meeting his eyes. She nodded. "Yeah, I think so." Tom smiled. "Good. You're doing great." Elaine looked away, her face flushing slightly. She wasn't used to praise. She wasn't used to feeling like she was doing something right, but Tom's words felt genuine, and that meant something to her. They worked together for the rest of the morning, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, making sure everything was in order. Elaine followed Tom's instructions, her hands growing steadier with each task. She could feel herself relaxing, the fear slowly starting to fade. When they were done, Tom led her back to the house. He made lunch, sandwiches again, and they sat at the table, eating quietly. Elaine felt the exhaustion settling in, but it was different from the exhaustion she'd felt before. It wasn't from fear or stress. It was from work. Honest work. After lunch, Tom looked at her, his eyes kind. "There's a bit more work to do this afternoon, if you're up for it. But if you need a break, that's fine too." Elaine thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like to help," she said. Tom smiled. "All right, then, let's get to it." They spent the afternoon working in the garden. Tom showed her how to pull weeds, how to till the soil. Elaine knelt down, her hands dirty, the sun warming her back. She could feel the tension slowly leaving her body. It wasn't much, but it was something. She was starting to feel like she could breathe again. Tom watched her, his face calm. He could see the change in her, the way her shoulders weren't as tense, the way her hands moved more confidently. He didn't say anything, just kept working, letting her find her own pace. As the sun began to set, They finished up, putting the tools away and heading back to the house. Elaine's body ached, her muscles sore from the work, but it was a good kind of tired. She felt like she'd accomplished something, no matter how small. Tom made dinner, soup this time, and they ate in silence. Elaine could feel the exhaustion taking over, her body relaxing into the chair. She looked at Tom, her voice soft. "Thank you. For today." Tom nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "You're welcome, Elaine. You did great." Elaine felt her eyes welling up, but she quickly blinked the tears away. She didn't want to cry, not now, not after a day like this. She took a deep breath, her hands resting on the table. "Get some rest," Tom said, his voice gentle. "We've got more work tomorrow." Elaine nodded, standing slowly. She walked to the living room, lying down on the couch. She pulled the blanket over her, closing her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was okay. She still had a long way to go, but today was a start, and that was enough. The next morning, Elaine woke up early again. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft orange glow over the fields. She got dressed and walked to the kitchen, where Tom was already up, frying eggs in a small pan. He looked up, giving her a nod. "Morning, Elaine," he said. "You sleep okay?" Elaine nodded. "Better," she said, her voice still a bit hesitant. She was getting used to being here, but part of her still held back. The fear hadn't completely disappeared. Tom smiled, his eyes kind. "Glad to hear it. How about some breakfast before we start the day?" Elaine nodded again, sitting at the table. Tom set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. They ate in silence for a while, the warmth of the food giving her a sense of comfort. After breakfast, Tom stood up, wiping his hands. "Today, we've got some work to do in the barn," he said, his tone casual. "You up for it?" Elaine looked at him, her face softening. "Yes, I'd like to help." They walked out together, the cool morning air refreshing against her face. The barn loomed ahead, its doors slightly ajar. Tom pushed them open, revealing the tools, the hay, and the animals inside. Elaine looked around, the smells of hay and earth filling her senses. Tom handed her a broom. "We need to sweep up in here. And after that, there's some cleaning to do with the tools." Elaine nodded, taking the broom. She started to work, her hands moving steadily. Tom worked alongside her, sweeping the opposite side of the barn. For a while, neither of them spoke, just the sound of the brooms brushing against the ground. When they were almost done, Tom paused, leaning on his broom. "You're getting better at this," he said, his voice light. "I mean it. You're a natural." Elaine looked at him, surprised. She wasn't used to compliments. She gave him a small smile. "Thanks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I know this isn't easy for you, but you're doing great, really." Elaine didn't know what to say. She looked down, her hands tightening around the broom handle. She wasn't used to someone being kind to her without wanting something in return. It felt strange, but with Tom, it also felt safe. They finished sweeping, and Tom showed her how to clean some of the tools, how to oil them, keep them in good shape. Elaine watched carefully, her hands moving slowly, but with growing confidence. Tom was patient, explaining each step, letting her learn at her own pace. Later, they took a break, sitting outside the barn. Tom handed her a bottle of water, and they both sat in silence, looking out over the fields. The sun had risen higher, warming the air. The animals moved around, the sounds of the farm filling the quiet. After a moment, Tom spoke. "You know, I lost someone too," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. Elaine looked at him, her eyebrows raising slightly. Tom kept his eyes on the horizon, his face calm but serious. "My wife," he continued. "She passed away a few years back. Cancer. It was tough. I didn't think I'd ever get through it." Elaine listened, her heart tightening. She hadn't expected Tom to open up like this. She watched him, the way his eyes seemed to cloud over with memories. She knew that look. She knew what it felt like to lose someone and to live with that pain every day. Tom looked at her, giving a small, sad smile. "I don't talk about it much, but I just wanted you to know that I get it. I know how it feels to be lost." Elaine swallowed, her throat tight. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of the water bottle. For a long time, she didn't say anything. But then, slowly, she looked back at Tom. I had a daughter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Tom's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "Her name is Sophia. She's with her grandmother now, but I haven't seen her in a while. Things got bad with Roberto, and I didn't want her around that." Tom nodded, his expression understanding. "That must have been hard." Elaine nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She quickly blinked them away, not wanting to cry. "It was, but I had to do it for her." Tom reached over, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You did the right thing. Sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that matter most." Elaine looked at him, her heart swelling. She hadn't talked about Sophia in so long. It felt like a weight had lifted, even if just a little. She took a deep breath, nodding. "Thank you," she whispered. Tom smiled. "Any time." They got back to work after that, moving to the fields to check on some of the fencing. They worked side by side, their movements in sync. For the first time, Elaine felt like she was part of something, like she belonged. It was a small feeling, but it was there, and it gave her strength. When they finished, the sun was beginning to set. They headed back to the house, Elaine's body aching from the day's work. But it was a good kind of tired. They made dinner together. Nothing fancy, just some stew and bread. They ate quietly, but the silence was comfortable, a shared understanding between them. After dinner, Tom looked at her, his voice soft. "You know, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. I mean that." Elaine looked at him, her eyes meeting his. She could see the sincerity in his face. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you. I think I'd like that." Tom nodded, smiling back. "Good. You're part of the farm now." Elaine felt a warmth in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She still had a long way to go, still had fears and doubts. But for now, she knew she was in the right place. And that was enough. The next few days started to blend together into a routine. Elaine woke up each morning to the sound of roosters crowing and goats bleating, and she slowly grew accustomed to the rhythm of life on the farm. She still felt moments of hesitation and uncertainty, but each day felt a bit easier than the last. Elaine stepped out of the small house, the early morning air cool against her face. Tom was already outside, his back to her as he poured feed into the chicken coop. He turned as she approached, giving her a small nod. "Morning, Elaine," he greeted warmly. "Ready to get started?" Elaine nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. She had grown used to Tom's easy demeanor. He never pushed her, never demanded anything from her. She felt like, for the first time in a long while, she could just be herself, without the constant fear of judgment. They worked in silence for a while, feeding the animals, gathering the eggs. As the sun rose, the warmth of the day began to spread over the fields. Tom looked at her, pausing as he reached into a crate. He pulled out a thick, worn jacket and held it out to her. "Here," he said. "It's starting to get colder out here. You should have something warmer." Elaine stared at the jacket, her throat tightening. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. She reached out, her hands brushing against the fabric as she took it from him. "Thank you," she whispered, slipping it on. It was warm, and she felt the heat spread across her shoulders, comforting and solid. Tom nodded, giving her a gentle smile. "Just take care of yourself, all right?" he said. Elaine looked at him, then nodded. She was beginning to realize that maybe it was okay to accept help sometimes. She had spent so long trying to fight everything on her own. But here, it felt different. It felt safe. As they finished up, Elaine found herself watching Tom. The way he took care of the animals, the small, gentle gestures he made as he worked. It reminded her of her mother, how she used to care for Elaine when she was a child. The way she would make sure Elaine was fed and warm, no matter how hard things were. It stirred something in her, a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Later that day, Elaine was in the kitchen, helping Tom prepare lunch. He showed her how to chop vegetables, his hands moving confidently as he explained each step. Elaine followed his instructions, her movements slow but sure. She could feel a small sense of accomplishment with each task completed. It was simple, but it felt like progress. As the afternoon wore on, Elaine found herself growing tired. But it was a good kind of tired, a tiredness that came from work, from doing something meaningful. She lay down that night, pulling the thick blanket over her, and for the first time in a long while, she slept without waking up in a panic. There were no nightmares, no memories of Roberto shouting or the cold road stretching endlessly. Just sleep, peaceful and quiet. The next morning, Elaine helped Tom with some repair work around the farm. The fence around the goat pen had a few broken boards, and Tom showed her how to nail in the new pieces. She followed his lead, her hands steady, the hammer in her grip. It felt good to build something, even if it was small. She could feel the difference it made, the way it kept the animals safe, the way it made things stronger. Tom watched her work, nodding in approval. "You're a natural at this," he said. Elaine smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. They spent the rest of the day working together, fixing what needed to be fixed, caring for the animals. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and they made their way back to the house. Elaine could feel her muscles aching, but it was a satisfying feeling, like she had done something worthwhile. After dinner, Tom looked at her, his voice soft. "Elaine, you've been doing a great job here. I mean that. I know things haven't been easy, but you've made real progress." Elaine looked at him, her eyes filling with emotion. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Tom gave her a gentle smile. "You've got a lot of strength, Elaine. More than you realize. You just have to keep believing in yourself." Elaine took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. She could feel something shifting inside her, a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in a long time. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. She looked out the window, the sky darkening as the stars began to appear. For the first time, she allowed herself to think about the future. It was still uncertain, still filled with unknowns. But maybe that was okay. Maybe she could face it, one day at a time. Elaine helped Tom clean up, washing the dishes and putting them away. As they worked, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't a grand moment. There were no big changes, no dramatic realizations. But it was enough. It was real, and it was hers. She went to bed that night, lying on the couch with the thick blanket pulled up to her chin. She closed her eyes, her body relaxing. She could hear the soft sounds of the farm outside, the wind rustling the leaves, the distant bleat of a goat. It was comforting, familiar. She let herself drift off, her mind at ease. The next morning, Elaine woke up feeling different, lighter. She got dressed, pulling on the thick jacket Tom had given her, and stepped outside. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the fields. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She was ready to keep moving forward, to face whatever came next. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could handle it. Elaine woke up before dawn. The sky was still dark, but she could already hear the roosters crowing outside, signaling the start of a new day. She got up from the couch, folding the blanket neatly, and walked to the kitchen. The air was crisp, and she felt the coolness on her skin as she moved around the small house. Tom was already in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He turned when he heard Elaine enter, giving her a warm smile. "Morning, Elaine," he said. "Ready for another day?" Elaine nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. She felt a sense of calm that had grown stronger each day she had spent here. It was different now. She wasn't just surviving. She was part of something, part of a place where she could contribute. Tom poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her. "We've got some work to do this morning," he said, nodding toward the door. "The animals are waiting, as usual." Elaine took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through her. She nodded, feeling ready for whatever the day would bring. "Let's get started." They walked outside together, the sky beginning to brighten with the first hints of dawn. Elaine moved with purpose, heading towards the pens where the goats were waiting. She picked up the bucket of feed, her hands steady, her steps sure. The goats gathered around, bleating softly, and Elaine smiled as she fed them. She could hear Tom working behind her, getting things ready for the rest of the morning tasks. There was a comfort in the routine now, a sense of normalcy that she hadn't felt in so long. Elaine moved from the goats to the chickens, gathering the eggs and making sure their water was clean. It was simple, but it mattered. When she was done, she walked over to Tom, who was finishing up near the barn. He looked at her, nodding approvingly. "You're getting good at this," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Elaine smiled, feeling a sense of pride. She had come a long way from the terrified woman standing on the side of that dark road. Here, she felt like she could do something, be something more than what Roberto had tried to make her. Tom led her back to the house, and together they started preparing breakfast. It was a small thing, scrambled eggs and toast, but Elaine found comfort in the familiarity of it. She moved around the kitchen, her movements more confident now. She wasn't just a guest here, she was a part of this life. They sat at the table, eating in comfortable silence. Tom looked at her after a while, his voice soft. "Elaine, I've got to say, it's been good having you here. The farm's been a bit quieter these past few years, and it's nice to have someone around again." Elaine looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Tom, for everything." Tom smiled. "You deserve it. You've worked hard, and you've earned your place here." Elaine felt tears welling in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of relief. She blinked them away, giving him a small smile in return. "I'm really grateful," she said. After breakfast, they went back outside. Tom handed her a few tools, and together they started working on some repairs that were needed around the farm. Elaine felt a sense of purpose as she worked, her hands moving with confidence. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of failing, not of the future. She knew she still had challenges ahead, but now she felt ready to face them. They finished the repairs by midday, and Tom suggested they take a break. They sat down on the steps of the barn, the sun high above them, warming their faces. Elaine looked out at the fields, her mind wandering. She thought of Sophia, her daughter. It had been so long since she had seen her. But now, for the first time, she felt like there was a future where they could be together again. Tom seemed to sense her thoughts. He looked at her, his voice gentle. "You ever think about going back to your daughter, finding a way to be with her again?" Elaine nodded, her throat tight. "Every day," she said. I want to make sure I'm ready. I want to be in a place where I can give her what she needs." Tom nodded, his expression understanding. "You will be. You're stronger than you know, Elaine. And when the time comes, you'll make it happen." Elaine looked at him, a sense of determination filling her. She knew he was right. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. She had a lot to work on, a lot to build, but she was ready. She was ready to fight for her daughter, for herself. As the day wore on, they finished up the rest of the tasks around the farm. Elaine could feel the tiredness settling into her muscles, but it was a good kind of tired. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from hard work, from building something real, and that made all the difference. That evening, as the sun began to set, Elaine and Tom sat on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. It was peaceful, and for once, Elaine felt like she could truly breathe. She looked over at Tom, her heart full. "Thank you for giving me a chance," she said softly. Tom shook his head, smiling. "You gave yourself a chance, Elaine. I just gave you a place to do it." Elaine nodded, her eyes looking out at the horizon. She still didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going back to the person she used to be. She had come too far, worked too hard. She was going to keep moving forward, no matter what. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, Elaine felt a sense of peace wash over her. She was ready to face whatever came next. Whether it was finding Sophia, building a new life, or just taking it one day at a time, she knew she could do it. For the first time in a long time, Elaine was hopeful. And that was enough.